Noam Chomsky, discussing Greenwald's new book, No Place to Hide, Edward Snowden, the NSA, and the U.S. Surveillance State. Greenwald is the best-selling author of How Would a Patriot Act and With Liberty and Justice for Some. His reporting on the NSA has won him numerous awards, and he has been acclaimed as one of the most influential political commentators today. He is joined tonight by Noam Chomsky, one of the world's leading public intellectuals. Chomsky has taught at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology since 1955, and his political and philosophical writings are known and acclaimed worldwide. In No Place to Hide, Greenwald recounts his trip to Hong Kong to meet with an anonymous source who had information on pervasive government spying. That source turned out to be Edward Snowden. Examining the broader implications of the surveillance and revealing fresh information on the NSA's abuse of power, Greenwald also takes on the establishment media for their avoidance of adversarial reporting on the government. He asks what it means for both individuals and the nation when a government pries so invasively into the private lives of its citizens. We are so very pleased to be hosting them tonight. Please join me in welcoming Glenn Greenwald and Noam Chomsky.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much on behalf of Professor Chomsky and myself for that really warm and generous welcome. And thank you so much as well to Professor Chomsky for agreeing to participate in this evening's event. I was here actually 2 years ago or so for my prior book with Professor Chomsky, and what I said at the time was that writing a book is a really solitary process. You sit there and write it, and you struggle with it, and the only people who are reading it are your editors who are constantly telling you how awful it is to justify the changes that they want to do that you're fighting against, and you really have no idea how people are going to react, and you can't wait to get it out into the world. And what I said 2 years ago is that there really is no greater honor than writing a book and then having the opportunity to discuss it with one of your premier intellectual heroes, really one of the most fearless and accomplished public intellectuals on the planet. And I certainly continue to think that, and it's a huge honor to have you here. And you know, it's funny, it's particularly generous of him to be here because, as he knows, before or as Edward Snowden sort of wormed his way into my existence, I happened to be working on a book about the way in which the establishment media constricts the range of acceptable political discourse, and was writing a book about how he had been treated by the US media as a window into understanding those dynamics. So he sort of got bumped by Edward Snowden. When somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'd like to give you tens of thousands of top secret documents from the most secretive agency of the world's most powerful government, you tend to put your current projects on hold. So I did, but I hope to return to that. I want to just talk a little bit about the reason I wrote the book, because there's a lot of obvious component parts that are worth discussing, I think. But I think it's a good idea to step back and talk about the impetus behind the book, because as I said, writing a book is a really grueling process, especially when you're trying to report on stories and do a variety of other things, and you need good reasons to do it. And I spent a good amount of time thinking about whether I wanted to do it and whether there was a sufficient reason to do it. And there are some general reasons why it made sense. For one, ever since I got these documents, I felt a very cumbersome obligation to my source, who unraveled his existence, to bring this information to the public and to galvanize a debate around the world, and also to the material and to the public, which had a right to not only see it, but to understand it and interact with it. And writing a book is a unique opportunity to reach people who don't spend their time reading newspapers or following debates. You can go around the world and talk about the importance of privacy and the menace of a secret surveillance state, and really help catalyze the debate even further. And I thought I had the obligation to do that. And the other part about writing a book is that when you're reporting on and writing on something every single day, you're focused on the immediate story before you. And it's hard to understand some of the underlying implications. And when you write a book, you're sort of forced to take steps back and look at how these issues connect with one another and what some of the underlying themes are, the sort of context for the reporting that you've been doing. And I think I had an opportunity to do that with this book, and it was really fulfilling and helpful to me, and I hope will inform the debate in a lot of ways. But a really significant reason why I decided to write the book is because so much has been said over the last year about Edward Snowden, about the reporting that we did, about the documents that we have, about the way in which we've disclosed them, so much of which has been completely untrue. And I really wanted to take the opportunity to present the definitive set of events as I saw them, to sort of as a corrective. And, you know, one of the things is, if you're somebody who enjoys bashing the American media, and I am somebody who enjoys that immensely, you know, it comes as no surprise that in the abstract you recognize that the American media all the time disseminates wildly false claims. I mean, that doesn't surprise, I'm sure, anybody in this room. You sort of see it from a distance, you know that they're making falsehoods and deceiving people, and that's something that we abstractly understand. But when you're actually at the center of one of the stories, and you know firsthand what actually happened, your appreciation for their eagerness and capacity to mislead substantially increases. It has really been, I don't know, maybe I was a little bit naive. I don't think so. But it has been a truly remarkable experience to watch the extent to which people in public life who have significant platforms just routinely and without the slightest thought spout all kinds of blatant falsehoods. You know, I remember when I was in Hong Kong, after we unveiled Snowden's identity for the first time, there was this consensus that arose among certain members of the media and the political class that this was clearly a spying operation run out of Beijing, that Snowden was almost certainly a Chinese spy. There were weeks of people who were saying this. And then once the Chinese government told him, you know what, you have to leave, and he flew to Russia on his way to Ecuador and got trapped in Moscow by the US government revoking his passport and bullying the Cubans into rescinding their guarantee of safe passage on his way to Ecuador. Those very same people who had been saying just 2 weeks earlier that he was clearly a Chinese spy suddenly switched on a dime and started saying, obviously, this is an operation run by Vladimir Putin. And I guarantee you tomorrow, if he flew to, I don't know, Lima, these same people would say, oh, he's obviously a Peruvian agent engaged in an espionage operation. They'll just say whatever they need to say to demonize him. And there was even a Wall Street Journal op-ed several days ago saying, we know for certain that this was either a Chinese espionage operation, a Russian espionage operation, or possibly a joint Sino-Russian plot. And it's really been just remarkable how seriously all of that has been taken, despite the fact that there's zero evidence to support any of it and enormous mountains of evidence that negate it. Similarly, there was this 2-week period after we revealed Snowden that was incredible. When I was in Hong Kong, I really wasn't paying attention to the extremely important musings of people like David Brooks and David Ignatius and Bob Schaefer and Jeffrey Toobin because I was a little bit busy. But I did go back in the course of writing this book to look at what the discourse was in the immediate aftermath of Snowden's unveiling. And I was really amazed because I've been pretty scornful of the notion that there's this active plotting among journalists and media outlets to coordinate their storyline. I generally think that they don't need to plot. They're just sort of appendages of a certain culture, and it just kind of comes naturally the way they all embrace each other's conventional wisdom. But within 24 to 48 hours, literally after we first introduced Edward Snowden to the world, there was this immediate consensus among all of these media elites that they were completely capable of taking this person that they had never heard of before and didn't know the first thing about and diagnosing him, clinically diagnosing him, psychologically assessing his pathologies. And they all somehow settled on this incredibly coordinated script that he was a fame-seeking narcissist. This is, if you Google it, you'll find this phrase over and over and over again, that this was the mental imbalance that led him to do what he did. It was obviously not any genuine dissatisfaction with the US government or what it was doing, because how could any sane person possibly be dissatisfied with the US government? There must be a mental condition that led him to do what he did. And that was the one they settled on. And it didn't just amaze me how coordinated it was. Where did they all get that? Where did that come from? That fame-seeking narcissist theme? I really want to know. But what really struck me about it was the very first conversation that I ever had with Edward Snowden, ever, online, before I knew who he was. What he said to me was, I want to do this, and I'm going to give you these documents, and when I give them to you, I am adamant about the fact that I want to identify myself as the source for these disclosures. And I want to come forward and explain to the world why I did what I did. And he said, the reason is that I feel I owe the world a duty to explain the motives and rationale behind what I did and not to allow other people to be falsely accused. And I'm proud of the choice that I made, so I want to stand up and take responsibility for it. And then he said, once I do that, once I make that public statement, I'm going to just disappear from media sight, because he knew that the objective of the national security state and its apologists and defenders would be to try and shift the focus away from the substance of the revelations, away from the fact that they were engaged in the largest and most pervasive system of suspicionless surveillance ever created in human history, and talk about his mental afflictions and why he was where he was and how he missed his girlfriend and what he did to her and all of that. And so he wanted to just disappear from sight and prevent them from doing that. You know, there's this fascinating history of how things are done to whistleblowers. You know, one of my childhood heroes politically was Daniel Ellsberg. And I've gotten to become friends with him. He's a colleague of mine. And I've talked to him about this before, because I never used to be able to understand why, in response to the leaking of the Pentagon Papers, the response of the Nixon administration was to break into the office of his psychiatrist in the hope of obtaining his psychosexual secrets. It never made any sense to me. Like, it seemed like the ultimate non sequitur, like, oh, look, we have documents showing that the US government has been systematically lying to the American people for years about the Vietnam War, and the response would be, well, Daniel Ellsberg is a swinger. Like, I never quite understood why they thought that would be effective. And I asked him about that, and what he said is, you're thinking about this way too rationally, that once you sufficiently demonize a person on a level that makes people uncomfortable, though everybody will want to avoid not just that person, but all of the fruits of their work and the message that they're delivering. It's an incredibly effective means of excluding somebody from decent company and making everything that they say instantly dismissed for that reason. You saw the same thing done to Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning and anybody who has delivered an uncomfortable message. And so Snowden was determined not to let that happen. And so literally for months after we revealed his identity, I got telephone calls on a daily basis, literally on a daily basis, from all of the very shining American TV personalities, the actors who play the role of journalist on TV, pleading with me to arrange for them to get an interview with him that they could put on primetime television. He could have spent months and months and months on every single major world television network, spouting and talking and pontificating and become the most famous person in the world, and yet he has steadfastly refused. In fact, to date, he has never given an interview to an American television network, precisely because he was completely uninterested in fame. In fact, he wanted to avoid it so that the focus could remain on the substance. And that is the person that all of our brilliant media pundits accused of being motivated by fame and being a narcissist. You can't find a person to whom that description applies less. I want to talk to you about the idea that the disclosures have helped the terrorist and been treasonous and all of those cliches that I'm sure you're already very familiar with. And the thing that makes me amazed about the extent to which this is voiced, and you know, I'm on a book tour, so I've done, I don't know, countless interviews with all kinds of establishment media outlets, and I don't think there has been a single interview I've done that didn't include some kind of question along the lines of, like, they put their very serious, somber faces on to signal that this is important, and they say, Mr. Greenwald, General Keith Alexander, the longtime chief of the NSA, said in an interview last week that he is certain that people will lose their lives as a result of these disclosures. Innocent people will be killed as a result of what you have revealed. Does that keep you up at night, the prospect that your reporting will result in other people's deaths? And what makes that so amazing to me isn't just that these officials are allowed to make these claims and have the media go forth and amplify them without the slightest expectation that there will be any evidence presented at all that any of that is true, right? I mean, that's not really remarkable anymore, the idea that media officials mindlessly amplify whatever government officials tell them without expecting any evidence to support it. That's the reason why we have the media debacle leading up to the Iraq War. That's not what surprises me. What surprises me is the fact that there is no awareness that in virtually every single case over the last 50 years where there have been whistleblowers who come forward or unauthorized disclosures, that's what media figures call it, unauthorized disclosures, meaning reporting things that the government didn't give you permission to report. In every single one of those cases, the same exact script is immediately and reflexively read from, and it continuously is proven to be false over and over and over again. And there's never any hesitation or thought of, well, maybe because they've said this every single time there's a story and it always turns out to be true, that we ought to treat it with a tad of skepticism. There's just a kind of immediate reflexive reaction that it ought to be taken seriously because they wear medals on their chest. And so a big part of writing this book is to detail just how capable of and devoted to deceit and public lying these same officials are, in the hope that their pronouncements will be treated much more skeptically in the future. So I just want to talk about a couple of other brief points in terms of the falsity of the public discourse that I was hoping to correct. And one of them is about the way in which we've reported these documents and the intentions that Edward Snowden had when he gave them to us. We have been criticized very predictably and very inconsequentially from what I will call, just for lack of a better term, the right, which is, primarily Democrats who voice this critique that our disclosures are going to help the terrorists and result in the deaths of innocent people and all of that. I was on C-SPAN 2 days ago, and every time the host said, and now we're going to go to the Democrat line, I knew I was about to be called a traitor. It was like completely reliable. So, that's the critique from the right. And there's a much more interesting and I think reasonable and even more valid critique that, for again, want of a better term, I'll call from the left, that has also been critical of how we've done the reporting, that has said, actually, you haven't released too much. You've actually released too little. And we think you should just take these documents and put them all online, or you should release them a lot more aggressively or a lot more quickly. You have all these documents and you've released only a small percentage. And so I wanted to make clear exactly what happened so that there's no confusion about how the story evolved and the reasons why. And when Edward Snowden came to us, he had a very, very clear and determined understanding of how he wanted these documents to be reported. He didn't want all of the documents uploaded to the internet. If he wanted that, obviously he didn't need me to do it. He's extremely capable, much more so than I am, of doing that. Had he wanted that to happen, he could have just done it himself, or he could have given it to other groups and asked that they do it, or he could have given it to me and asked that I do it. That isn't what happened. He was inspired by prior whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks, and Thomas Drake and others, and wanted to learn from the ways in which they had been effectively attacked and the importance of their revelations diluted and undermined. And he was determined not to let the debate be all about why is there this reckless, indiscriminate disclosures, even though that wasn't the case for any of those prior instances. That was the attack that was made. And so he said, I want you to go very carefully through each of these documents and to report them journalistically one by one, meaning explain to the public exactly what these documents are, do reporting to make them even clearer, and let each story breathe so that people can react and debate and let the story unfold, and that we can say credibly that we're releasing these documents in a manner that's systematic, so that they couldn't demonize the disclosures. And that was a framework to which I agreed when I took the documents, which for me ends the debate. Even if I didn't think that was the right approach, I would never violate my agreement to him, no matter who doesn't like it. But I also think it was the right thing to do. And the evidence, I think, that vindicates that strategy is the fact that I've been writing about surveillance for 8 years, and it's a very hard thing to get people to pay attention to or care about. They think it's remote, they think it's abstract, it can be complicated. And yet here we are a year later, and interest in this topic is more sustained and more intense than it was back in June when we first started revealing the stories. There are incredible reform movements around the world, people's changing how they think, not just about surveillance and privacy, but about the role of the United States and the dangers of vesting their own government with power to be exercised in secret, and the proper role of journalism vis-a-vis the state. I think these issues have been debated in a more serious way and in a more intense way around the world for a longer period of time than almost any other story that I've seen, and I think that really vindicates the strategy that he insisted upon and that we agreed to undertake. And whatever else is true, that strategy is not what has been depicted. It is the opposite of a reckless and indiscriminate strategy. It is a very strategically precise strategy of trying to make sure that the debate proceeds constructively by choosing the documents to release in a way that the public can best understand, which I think is the duty of an activist and the duty of a journalist as well. The last point I want to make, and then I will turn it over to Professor Chomsky, is there is a much more important point to me to the Edward Snowden story and to telling it than just correcting the record and clearing up all those misconceptions. And that is that, for me, there is an extraordinarily valuable lesson to learn from everything that has happened here. I have been going around talking about all sorts of issues relating to war on terror abuses and fundamental defects in the American criminal justice system and all of these other kinds of issues. And invariably, the question that everybody asks is, well, what can I do about it? And embedded in that question oftentimes is a sense of defeatism, the idea that these forces are so formidable that I don't really feel as though, as outraged as I may get, that I have within me the capacity to do anything about them. And I know Professor Chomsky has talked about that question and that mindset a lot before and said he really only hears it in the United States or in the West and not typically in other countries where they feel like they have an outlet and know what to do, which is take it upon themselves to change it. But the reason I think there's such a valuable lesson here is that whatever else you think about Edward Snowden, when I met him, he was 29 years old. He was raised in a lower middle class to middle class environment by a father who was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. He has no family connections. He had no power, no prestige. He was as ordinary as it gets, completely obscure, no support institutionally in any way. He was just an ordinary individual who, through nothing more than an act of conscience, acting more or less alone, literally changed the world. And the lesson for me that profoundly influenced how I think and how I did everything from that point forward, and what I think probably for the rest of my life, is really clear to me, which is that no matter who you are and no matter how inadequate you think you are when arrayed against these very powerful forces, we all have within us the ability, when we summon the proper will and really make the choice to do so in defense of the things that we say we believe, to affect not minor but radical and fundamental change in the world. And I think the decision and choice that he made should be the permanent antidote to that kind of defeatism. And I wanted to convey that lesson in writing the book and going around and talking about it, and I hope I did. So thanks very much, and turn it over to Professor.
I think I quite agree with you. What he achieved does drive home that lesson, which is one that we should really be familiar with. Almost every significant change that's ever happened was sparked by often isolated individuals who were willing to take a stand on something. So take, say, the modern civil rights movement. Civil rights movement goes back centuries, but it really took off in the modern period around 1960. And if you just look at the incidents that were involved, it very much underscores what Glenn is saying. So in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, a couple of black students decided to sit in at a Woolworth's lunch counter and asked to be served. Of course, they were immediately arrested, brutalized, sent off. Could have been the end of it, except the next day, more students came. Pretty soon you had the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You had freedom riders going through the South, really risking their lives. It was not easy. Beaten, attacked, killed. Some Northerners came down. A number of them were murdered. Finally, you had legislative changes, which were partial victories, but nevertheless significant victories. And I think this is true in every case I know. Let me take one of a very different kind. Which hadn't been in 1975, the Indonesian government invaded the former Portuguese colony of East Timor nearby, mainly because they wanted to gain control of the oil of the region. The invasion was murderous. It led to virtual genocide, probably killed third of the population. The U.S. strongly supported it from the very beginning. So did Britain, so did other allies, mainly because Indonesia is a rich prize. It's, a lot of resources, a lot of investments, make a lot of profit from it, powerful, very significant strategically. There were about 3 or 4 people, I could name them, some of them students, who dropped out of school, devoted their lives to trying to organize on this topic. Their names, like Snowden, nobody knows their names, practically nobody, except those who were involved. They don't want to be known. But they succeeded in bringing other people to become involved. A lot of the speaking that I did was organized by them. Testimony at the General Assembly was organized by them. They spread to other countries. Finally, in 1999, September 1999, 25 years after this genocidal assault, Bill Clinton, president, said a couple of words. He informed the Indonesian generals that the game's over. They have to withdraw. Prior to that, they were saying they'd never withdraw. This was their territory. They'd annexed it. They got a word from the White House, and they instantly withdraw. A few people were responsible for this. Let's go to the media coverage. The media knew all about this for 25 years. There was extensive reporting in Australia. There were all kinds of leaks. Take a look at the record. Virtually nothing. And then look what happened when Clinton declared it over. The reporting wasn't, look, this shows that you guys are incredible criminals. You were responsible for what happened all these years. The response was magnificent act of humanitarian intervention because Clinton intervened, stopped the crimes. The Indonesian army withdrew. That allowed a UN peacekeeping force to enter. A wonderful tribute to humanitarian intervention. Aren't we magnificent? This happens over and over again. When you were talking about the Sino-Soviet conspiracy, what came to my mind is an interesting case of it. There's a wonderful book that I'd urge you to read if you haven't, by an old friend of mine, Jim Peck, who's a very good China scholar. The book's called Washington's China. What he did was go through the records of the declassified records of the National Security Council, for the entire period up to what had been released when he wrote the book, and presented their account of what the Chinese, their analysis of China's role in the world. There was a conclusion that was consistent through all the accounts. China's a terrible threat. But what changed over the years is the reasons. When China was more or less friendly to Russia, or it looked that way, China's a terrible threat because it's a puppet of Moscow. When China was practically at war with Russia, a couple of years later, China's a terrible threat because the Russians are kind of more or less moderate and the Chinese are extreme. And no matter what the facts were, you always got the same conclusion. The most interesting case, and one that people really ought to be taught in elementary school, is what happened with regard to Indochina. In the late 1940s, the U.S. was kind of ambivalent about which third world movements to destroy and which ones to support. There were conflicting goals. The U.S. had objections to traditional European imperialism because it kept out U.S. interests, so they wanted it dismantled. On the other hand, third world nationalist movements are even more of a threat. So various choices were made. In the case of Indochina, in the late 1940s, the U.S. was more or less supportive to the Viet Minh, towards the Vietnamese independence movement. It had fought with the U.S. during the war, fought against the Japanese, and so on. Around 1950, the U.S. government decided to support the French in their effort to reconquer Indochina. At that point, orders went out to the intelligence agencies to prove that Ho Chi Minh was a puppet of China or Russia or the Sino-Soviet conspiracy. Anything would do, very much like what you described. And for a couple of years they worked on it. And the results are pretty interesting. The final reports a couple of years later were that it's very strange, but Hanoi seems to be the only place in the region where there's no contacts with China or Russia. Well, the conclusion that was drawn by the wise men in the State Department, Dean Acheson and so on, is that proves our point. They are such a loyal puppet of, take your choice, Peking, as it was called, Moscow, the conspiracy, that they don't even have to give them orders. And you take a look at the reporting over the years, it follows whatever the conclusion is religiously. And it's the same way on just about every issue you can think of. There's kind of an interesting case in the case of the Iraq War, as you mentioned, when George Bush and his gang decided they were going to invade Iraq, they spread all kind of stories about, mushroom cloud over New York and so on and so forth. The media totally reported it. No occasional questions, not much, just solid drumbeat of approval. The reason for the war, if you look back, was a single question. That's what Bush and Blair repeated over and over. There's a single question. Will Saddam Hussein put an end to his programs of development of nuclear weapons? That was the single question. Well, as you remember, after a couple of years of investigation, the single question got the wrong answer. There hadn't been any such programs, with an interesting exception, apart from the ones that the U.S. supported. What you won't see reported is that George Bush, number one, and Reagan were such enthusiastic supporters of Saddam Hussein that when the war with Iran was over, Bush was then president. He actually invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to come to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. Well, that's not the kind of thing to report. Anyhow, after the last 10 years, there have been no programs. What happened? The story changed. It wasn't nuclear weapons. That was not the reason why we entered. We entered because of our love of democracy. This was part of our democracy promotion project. And in fact, if you look back in November 2003, Bush gave a well-advertised speech, National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, a rating about our love of democracy, and that's why we had to invade Iraq, to bring democracy to the Iraqi people and so on. Take a look at the journalism. Like you said, turned on a dime. Of course, there were some things they didn't read, and public opinion kind of more or less follows it. Not entirely, though. There were international polls asking people what they thought about the U.S. democracy promotion program. And one place they asked them was in Iraq. I think about 1% of the population took it seriously. They had a little experience with it. That goes on right to the present. We have a democracy promotion program in the Middle East. That's why we supported the Arab Spring and we're opposed to dictators and so on. There are international polls asking people what they think about this. In the Arab world, maybe 5% think maybe it's serious. Almost everybody regards it as total nonsense. Can you get that reported here? No. In fact, the things that can't be reported are pretty spectacular. Last December, for example, there was a poll, international poll, top polling agencies, Gallup in the United States, their counterpart in England, and asking various questions. One of the questions that was asked was, which country in the world is the greatest threat to world peace? Guess what? The United States was so far in the lead, nobody was even close. Way below was Pakistan, and that was inflated because of the Indian vote. Iran, nobody, not China, and so on. I had a friend do a database check. There was one report on it in the United States in a Murdoch journal, right-wing Murdoch journal, New York Post. They reported it and said, this is very interesting. It shows how crazy the world is. You know, that's it. But what I think it's redundant to say that I urge you to read the book, but I really do. It does bring this home in a very remarkable way. Also, it brings home some other lessons, which Glenn didn't mention, but I think are worth stressing. It's common discourse. If you studied political science or international relations, read the press. Governments are committed to security. That's their major goal. They're committed to security against their enemies. There's a couple of things that are not asked. Security for whom and who are the enemies? Well, it turns out that one of the major enemies is you. One of the major enemies of every government is its own population. They're dangerous. We got to know everything about them that we can. We have to control them. We have to make sure they don't get out of hand. Every power system believes this, certainly governments do. And this is demonstrated with spectacular clarity in especially in the book, which brings it together. I'd read the reports when they came out, but reading it together in the book is different. You see it much more dramatically. Second point is, whose security are they concerned with? Is it security of the population? Well, certainly not. In fact, after Glenn in the book reports the spectacular lying of Obama, Keith Alexander, high officials, about how this operation is protecting us from, I think the first claim was 54 terrorist attacks were foiled. And then it went down to about a dozen terrorist attacks were foiled. And finally, there was a government commission which was appointed to investigate how many terrorist attacks were foiled. Now, they had access to high-level security, internal documents, all the best sources. They did find something. One person had sent $8,000 to Somalia. That's what this massive operation of control of everything you do is about. Well, that tells you whose security is being, that's a good example of whose security is being protected. It's the security of state power from its enemy. And one of the main enemies is the population. Occasionally a ray of light comes through on this. Tribute to Harvard, I'll quote the professor of the science of government at Harvard. I always liked that title. There was a professor of the science of government at Harvard, Samuel Huntington. Back in 1981, he pointed out that, I forget his exact words, something like this, that power has to operate in the dark. When it's exposed to sunlight, it wilts and evaporates. And then he went on at the same time to say that ever since the Truman Doctrine, 1947, it's been necessary to try to convince the American people that we're defending them from the Russians. Of course, we're not. Other goals. But that's what we have to convince them. And that requires that power operate in the dark. That's the reason for secrecy. All of this demonstrates it clearly. You can find it just by searching through declassified documents. If you go through that boring, occasionally illuminating activity, you find that genuine security is almost never an issue. What is the main issue is making sure that power can operate in the dark for its own reasons. Support for state power and support for private power. One of the striking things that emerged from the Snowden revelations, Glenn emphasized in his book, is the extent to which economic espionage is at the core of these massive operations. And not just the United States. Like, for example, Canada, a big mining country, uses these techniques to try to find out what's happening in the Brazilian mining and energy industries. The U.S. does the same. Trading partners and so on. You have to expose everything for the benefit of the forces that really matter, which are not the population. The population has to be controlled, subdued, frightened, misled, and these are among the lessons that I think come out with a dramatic clarity from the revelations, and particularly from the book which put together.
All right, great. So thank you so much for that. So what we want to do is have a Q&A session, and I'm not sure, I think they told you what the format was, what the instructions are. I wasn't part of that, so I don't know. I guess people just line up in this middle aisle here, and then we'll just take them one by one for as long as we can. That was very acrobatic. Excuse me.
Professor Chomsky, given that American power only seems constrained by two things, the first being that which is required to avoid a revolution, and second, its technological capability for abuses and excesses, and I'm not even sure of the first, frankly. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on where the surveillance state is proceeding, because as I said, it seems to be simply limited by the technological capability to exploit the population and to spy on it. And so there may be a time when we look back on today and admire the amount of freedoms that we had given that constraint, particularly the development with the Obama administration having essentially normalized the procedures of the Bush administration.
Well, they have. And Obama, I never frankly had many expectations for Obama. I wrote about him critically before the first primaries. But he has surprised me on one thing. I don't know about you. His attack on civil liberties. I really don't see the point of this. And it's the attack on the Fourth Amendment, which of course is a devastating attack on the Fourth Amendment, any reasonable reading of it, but it goes well beyond. So to mention two other cases, which are not that well known. One of them is a case, if you want to look it up, it's Holder, Attorney General v. Humanitarian Law Project. It's a case brought by the Obama administration against Humanitarian Law Project, but the Supreme Court validated the Obama position. The Humanitarian Law Project was a legal aid group. It was giving legal advice to a group that's on the government's terrorist list. The government's terrorist list, incidentally, is an abomination. It should not be tolerated in a free society. You can be on the terrorist list if the president says, "I don't like you," then you're on the terrorist list. And if you take a look at who was on the terrorist list, it's pretty remarkable. So, for example, Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist list until a couple of years ago, because the Reagan administration had determined that he's one of the more notorious terrorists in the world. On the other hand, Saddam Hussein was taken off the terrorist list in 1982 because the Reagan administration wanted to provide him with aid for his attack on Iran. So he was off the terrorist list. The whole idea of it is grotesque. It is never questioned. But putting that aside, they gave legal advice to a group on the terrorist list. That was described by the Obama administration in the legal proceedings as material assistance to terrorism. Okay? Material assistance used to mean you give a terrorist a gun or something. Now it means you give them legal advice. And if you read the colloquy, the discussion in the court, it could extend as far as having an interview with Hassan Nasrallah, head of Hezbollah, which I've had. Anything that gives any credibility to people they call terrorists is material assistance. Now, there's another one, the NDAA, which is sort of similar. That's the national defense, the budget for the military. It has a provision in it which allows the military to hold people permanently without charge, to detain them permanently without charge. Primarily, they're talking about foreign citizens, but it has a provision that in principle makes it open to American citizens. There is a court case initiated by Chris Hedges against this provision. I'm one of the plaintiffs, but I wasn't very happy about it, frankly, because the case is concentrated on American citizens, and the kind of tacit assumption is if you want to pick up somebody who isn't an American citizen and hold him indefinitely without charge, apparently that's okay. We shouldn't be conceding that. But anyway, the case went through at the district level. It won, the plaintiffs won, but then the government immediately appealed it to higher levels. It's been sustained, and it extends the notion of material assistance to terrorism to substantial aid to terrorism, whatever that means. Like talking to them, for example. This will go to the Supreme Court and it'll be ratified. Now, what does Obama get out of pressing home an attack on civil liberties that goes well beyond anything you could even get any political gain out of? That's the one thing about the administration that's really surprised me. And you're quite right. Every one of these things sets a standard which the next president can go beyond. Doesn't have to, but it tends to work that way. And if we accept it, if we don't do what Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and other people are doing and really struggle against it, then we're complicit in the further erosion of the liberties that we have and have fought for people have fought for years.
I can rest safely now, knowing that we've all provided material support to terrorists.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you both for your work. So, Mr. Greenwald, one of the things that has stood out about this Snowden saga is its international scope. Traveling to Hong Kong, to Russia. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that you are not based in the United States. And people have become exiled over this, over the affairs with WikiLeaks. They are no longer welcome in their own countries. With endeavors like First Look Media, how are you stepping outside of national boundaries in order to more effectively report on these kinds of issues that can alienate you so intensely if you are embedded in a national culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the most overlooked aspects of the story has been exactly what you just raised, which is that the story really is global in nature. The first story that I really concentrated on after I started writing about politics in 2005 was the revelation about NSA eavesdropping on Americans without the warrants required by the criminal law. And that story involved companies like Verizon and Sprint and AT&T, which are overwhelmingly domestic, and it involved only the communication of American citizens and was exclusively a domestic controversy. And what made this story so explosive, not in the United States only, but globally, was the fact that the internet is a global means of communication. You can't invade it and segregate the impact only to certain countries. You invade the internet, it means that you're invading communications internationally. And beyond that, the companies that are implicated, who have eagerly participated with the NSA for all sorts of reasons, such as Facebook and Google and Skype, and Microsoft and Yahoo, are the means that hundreds of millions of people, not in the United States, but around the world, use as their primary means of communication. And then beyond that, there was this incredible international scope to the story. It wasn't just me working outside of the country, but my close collaborator and partner, Laura Poitras, who worked from Berlin, because as a filmmaker, she had been long afraid to be in the United States because she thought that her film would be subpoenaed. The stories that we did, we purposely partnered with media outlets in every country around the world so that the people most affected by the revelations would have their own media outlets reporting on it, with journalists in those countries who knew them best to maximize the impact internationally. And you know, when I go around the United States, sometimes people say, well, what really has changed? What are the big significant reforms and outcomes? And usually that question is confined domestically. And there are lots of changes in the United States, and I think there are a lot more to come as more reporting unfolds and the like. But the real changes have been, I think, in terms of the dynamic internationally. You know, there's so many things that have happened in the story that some really significant ones get overlooked. But one of my favorite events that has happened way back in June of 2013, when the United States, for 2 weeks after we unveiled Snowden in Hong Kong, was demanding, with increasing levels of aggression, that the government in Hong Kong turn Snowden over to them in order for them to arrest him and bring him back to the United States. And rather than comply, which is what everyone in the American media thought they would do, to the point they were mocking Snowden for his choice of Hong Kong, which was a stupid choice, they said, because of course Hong Kong is going to obey the dictate of the United States. Instead, the government of Hong Kong said, we'd like you to put you on this plane and have you go wherever you want. And then the day they did that, and if you haven't seen it, please go look at it when you get home, because it's the funniest thing ever. They issued this statement saying, the United States government has submitted a request to the government of Hong Kong to detain Edward Snowden and turn him over. Unfortunately, the documents that the United States government submitted were filled out improperly, and we therefore have no choice but to let him go. And then the last paragraph said, it began with the word, meanwhile, we have recently learned that the United States government is invading the communications of our civilian infrastructures, our research facilities, and our universities, and we think an investigation is warranted. And the reason that was so significant, aside from how hilarious it is that it signaled that there was going to be this change of tenor in how the United States was perceived. And after that happened, country after country, government after government publicly defied the U.S. in a really brazen and unapologetic way, unlike what almost never happens. And you saw Russia do it when they granted him asylum and refused to turn him over when he was in the airport. And you saw Latin American countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua and Bolivia all formally offer him asylum. And you saw Ecuador publicly argue for his asylum. And then you saw Brazil, which has always had this sort of complex of being subservient to the United States because it's been dominated through all kinds of colonial and imperialist policies, not only cancel the state visit, the first that they honored the Brazilian president with in 40 years, but then the president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, whose conversations were themselves targeted and invaded, as we reported in Brazil, went to the UN and vehemently denounced the United States in very harsh terms of human rights and privacy, while President Obama lurked angrily out in the hallway. And Germany has done the same thing. It has damaged international relations. It has changed the way that people think about the United States all over the world. And when you start changing consciousness, and not just consciousness about how people think about surveillance or privacy, but about how they think about their own government's power and the role of the United States and a whole variety of other issues, fundamental change will emerge. And it will emerge quickly and probably in ways that we can't even anticipate. And I think the most exciting part of the story is exactly what you asked about, which is the international scope, really the global scope of how this story has played out.
Greenwald, Professor Chomsky. If there is a theme to your book, I'm sorry, If there is a theme to your book, which I just finished reading, is that for me was growth, not only from your laptop getting stolen from your house, and that changing your resolution to how hard you were going to tackle the issues even harder, to learning how to install a program, a computer program for hacking purposes or for communicating. So for me, the theme of your book was really growth, your personal growth, and I think that's what I see for the last year. And I guess my question is, what has this last year taught you personally? And for Professor Chomsky, just real quick, it was really hard to find a book of you in Spanish, and it took me like a month. I would be honored if you could please sign it for my dad. If you could sign the book for my dad, I would be.
He wants you to sign the book. Yeah. I think we're going to both be around a little bit after to sign. So, just as far as the question you asked, I mean, I talked a lot about the primary lesson that I feel like I learned from being able to observe Edward Snowden. But, I also, and then I've obviously learned, specific kinds of information, such as how to encrypt my communications, which has proven to be very important. And, that's one of the things, the importance of which shouldn't be underestimated is if we all start encrypting our communications, it makes it impossible for the NSA or close to impossible for them to invade our communications. That's something we can do to empower ourselves now that we know how much our privacy is being compromised. But there is another really crucial lesson that, I think I learned, which is, Laura and I have talked about this a lot, which is once we realized the fearlessness that drove Edward Snowden's choice, we felt an obligation to have our work be driven by the same spirit of fearlessness. And once we started doing that, other people with whom we were working, including a very large media institution that has all the same impediments and concerns, which is The Guardian, actually began being infected by that same sort of spirit and did actually give me enormous support to report this story as aggressively as I thought it should be reported. And then huge numbers of people around the world that I hear from all the time, journalism students and other kinds of people who thought they were going to go work for tech companies and have decided not to, or journalist students who say, I now understand that the purpose of journalism is to keep people in power in check. There's this massive ripple effect. And I do think that this phrase, courage is contagious, it's probably something that if somebody said to me 5 years ago or 2 years ago, I would have sort of abstractly agreed with. It's now something that is a statement, a principle that I know is true on a really visceral level, and it can happen really quickly. And the ways in which you can impact other people's thought process and choices is virtually limitless if you act with passion and fearlessness. Okay.
Mr. Greenwald, Professor Chomsky, if you would both comment on the various roles of the various professions of a journalist and an academic in the world today, in light of their the freedom, the effectiveness, and the limitations of both roles. For example, I would imagine being a journalist, you would be limited by what the public finds interesting, some of the less than savory characteristics of media. And then as an academic, I would imagine you would be limited by feeling obligated to help students navigate through a system that is not entirely beneficial, and that the government itself considers its primary threat to be the people of the country itself.
I'll start with that. I have always resisted pretty vigorously any kind of label that feels self-limiting. It's one of the reasons why I resist ideological labels, because it sort of announces in advance that you're supposed to have a certain belief system regardless of how you engage on an issue and where your rationality takes you. And the same is true of these roles. There was a debate early on about whether or not I was an activist or a journalist, as though they were mutually exclusive. And I actually found the debate really confusing because I absolutely consider myself to be both. And I don't think they distract from one another in any way. I think they fuel themselves. I think journalists who don't have a sense of activism, meaning a desire to have what they're doing have positive effects in the world, are practicing this really impotent, neutered, soulless, deadened, boring form of the practice that has actually killed it and made it not only corrupted, but really just boring and uninteresting. And so I think that if you, whatever you do in your job or in your life, if you think that there are limits on what that role entails intrinsically, just ignore them, violate those rules, and do the things that you want that you think can help you transcend those limits. I mean, he is a professor, but he's way more than that, right? And so I think that that's kind of what I was saying before, was that, you know, I think we all have it within ourselves to have this profound effect on the world, and the question is finding what is in yourself and creating your own rules to maximize it and not let it be limited. John?
It's a sound question. Questions like that bring to my mind interesting comment by George Orwell, which isn't as well known as it should be. His book Animal Farm, everybody's read, probably in elementary school. He had an introduction to Animal Farm, which very few people read. For one reason, it wasn't published. It was found 30 years later, after his death. In the introduction, the book, of course, is a bitter, satiric critique of the totalitarian enemy. And in the introduction, he addresses himself to the people of England, free England. And he says, you shouldn't feel too self-righteous when you read this, because in England, under freedom, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And he doesn't go into the reasons very much, but one line is relevant to your question. He says one of the reasons is a good education. If you have a good education, going to the best schools, you know, Oxford, Cambridge, you have internalized the understanding that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say. And I think students should be liberated from that internalized indoctrination. How they decide to navigate through the perils of their lives, yes, that's difficult, and you know, I wouldn't feel that I'd have any reason to give them advice about it, but they should at least gain the understanding of it, not only of the nature of the system of indoctrination and control, the kind of things Glenn's talking about, but also the internal fact that you have been trained since childhood to have it instilled into you, so you don't ask the questions, you don't think about it. Now, that's a form of entrapment and attack on personal integrity that is very extreme. In some ways, you could say worse than torture, and people ought to be liberated from that.
So just as a note, we have time for just one more question, and then we will begin the book signing.
Thank you for a remarkable, fearless work, Mr. Greenwald. I have actually two quick questions for you. One is, how do you choose the order in which to release the documents? And also the second one is, can you elaborate a little bit on whether and how the American government has targeted you as a person, and especially in the last year, I guess, so we better understand, you know, what happens. Thanks.
Yeah, you know, the way that we choose to release the document is a pretty simple formula, which is that we go through them continuously and have been going through them continuously for the past 11 months. And as soon as we find something that we think is significant and interesting and newsworthy, we work as hard as we can, as fast as we can, to get it ready to be published. It is a frustrating process, because if you're going to publish top secret documents, the position of the US government is that you're committing a felony, even if you are working within a media organization, and nobody's going to do that without going through a vetting process of editors and lawyers, and it has been a little bit irritating to try and get this done more quickly, because there are always lots of impediments. But, you know, Laura and I and lots of other journalists have both been working literally 15 hours a day, 7 days a week for 11 months on nothing but this archive. And there still are a lot of other stories that are left to be done, including some huge ones, not because I'm purposely saving them, but because the reporting is really difficult. If you're going to report, for example, on who exactly the US government has targeted in terms of surveillance, and you want to name those people so you can illustrate the kinds of abuses that are taking place. You want to make sure that you're not injuring people's reputations or harming them against their will. And you want to make sure that you're extremely careful and certain about the things that you're saying. And these things take time, which is, you know, I know frustrating for people out there waiting for stories and also for me, but it's a necessary part of the process. As far as being targeted, you know, I mean, it really is true, and it's not just false humility. I mean, journalists all over the world who do good journalism, almost by definition, get targeted in all sorts of ways, and usually they work in obscurity as opposed to great visibility, and the ways in which they're targeted are much worse than anything I've endured. Journalists go to war and get killed. I was on a panel once with this Brazilian journalist who uncovered massive corruption in the local police force where he lived in a totally obscure and anonymous way. He investigated this police force for 2 years. He got death threats. He got rocks thrown through his window. He got beaten up. His wife left him because she felt like he was subjecting their children to danger, and he just continued. I would never have known his name had I not been on this panel with him. It got the entire police force fired and new police officers put in. And that happens all over the world all the time to journalists. I really have had newfound respect for the ability of journalism to achieve positive change when it's done correctly. But of course, I mean, the intention of the US government from its continuous public statements at the highest levels of the Obama administration that what I specifically was doing and the work I was doing was criminal, was a felony, constituted selling documents, was something I ought to be arrested for, was a very deliberate strategy to create this climate of fear around the journalism that was taking place, so that every time we went to publish a document, we were supposed to think, is this the thing that's going to push me over the line and make them arrest me? I had lawyers who usually can get Eric Holder on the phone in 2 seconds who got no information every time they tried to find out whether Laura and I would be arrested when we returned to the US because they deliberately wanted us to remain in this state of uncertainty. Obviously, detaining my partner halfway across the world while I was back in Brazil and locking him in a room for 11 hours under a terrorism law, and then announcing that there was a criminal investigation against him under this terrorism statute, or marching into the Guardian's newsroom and demanding while agents of the government oversaw it that they destroy their computers, was all very thuggish attempts to do the same thing. And so there was genuine concern. You take those things seriously if you're at all rational, that the journalism could subject you to serious danger. But the thing that we vowed from the very beginning is that under no circumstances would it ever deter us from publishing a single document. And honestly, if anything, it just absolutely emboldened me to work harder, because when they show their thuggish face, it makes you realize how much more important than you thought before transparency is. And, you know, we finally came back just on principle because we weren't going to be kept out of our own country for completely invalid reasons of intimidation. But they often, as Professor Chomsky was just saying, there are lots of ways to intimidate people and cause people to censor their own rights without overt shows of force. And this climate of fear, even talking openly about imprisoning journalists, having graphics on the CNN screen like I saw multiple times, should Glenn Greenwald be prosecuted, where a little panel of pundits debates that. It's all intended to make journalists think really carefully before they do this kind of reporting. Okay, great. Thank you everyone very much. Really appreciate it.